My name is Holly Bennett. I'm 30 years old, and 3 years ago I gave my sister a kidney. 6 months ago she got married and I wasn't on the guest list. I want to tell you both of those things up front, plainly, without softening either one, because the space between them is where this entire story lives. My sister Paige is 2 years younger than me. We grew up in a small house in Tulsa with parents who loved us but didn't have much extra of anything. Not money, not time, not the kind of attention that lets you really see your kids as individuals instead of just two children who needed feeding and driving and occasionally disciplining. Paige and I raised each other in a lot of ways. I made her lunch in the mornings when our mom worked early shifts. She used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms even when she was old enough that she probably shouldn't have needed to. We were close. Genuinely, deeply close, the way sisters are in movies but rarely are in real life. That closeness is what made everything that happened later feel so impossible to process. Paige was diagnosed with focal segmental glomerulosclerosis when she was 22. It's a kidney disease, progressive, the kind that starts as protein in your urine during a routine physical and ends, eventually, in dialysis or transplant if it isn't caught and managed carefully. Paige's case moved faster than her doctors expected. By 24, she was in early-stage kidney failure. By 25, she was on the transplant list and starting dialysis 3 times a week. I watched my little sister become a person who scheduled her entire life. 4 hours, 3 times a week, sitting in a chair with tubes running blood out of her body and back in, exhausted afterward in a way that took the rest of the day to recover from. She lost weight. She lost color in her face. She lost the version of herself that used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, replaced by someone tired and frightened and trying very hard not to show either. The transplant list for a deceased donor kidney in Oklahoma was, at that time, running an average wait of 3 to 5 years. Paige's doctors told her that a living donor would dramatically improve both her timeline and her long-term outcomes. I got tested within 2 weeks of hearing that. I didn't agonize over the decision the way some people might expect. I know that sounds simple, almost naive, but it genuinely was simple to me. Paige was my sister. I had 2 and only needed 1. The math, emotionally and literally, was not complicated. The testing process took about 4 months: blood type compatibility, tissue typing, a full psychological evaluation, an extensive physical workup to make sure I was healthy enough to be a donor, and that my remaining kidney would be sufficient for my own long-term health. I was, as it turned out, an excellent match. Same blood type, strong tissue compatibility, healthy enough at 27 to sail through every test they threw at me. The surgery happened on a Tuesday in March, almost 4 years ago now. I remember the morning of it more vividly than almost anything else in my adult life. The pre-op room, Paige in the bed next to mine because they did our surgery simultaneously in adjoining rooms, both of us in those thin hospital gowns, holding hands across the gap between our gurneys until the nurses came to wheel us in different directions. "I'll see you on the other side," Paige said. "I'll be right there," I told her. The surgery itself took about 3 hours. Mine was laparoscopic, relatively minimal recovery as these things go, though minimal is a relative term when someone has removed an organ from your body. I was in the hospital for 2 nights. Paige stayed longer, almost a week, as her body adjusted to the new kidney and her medical team monitored for rejection. I remember waking up in recovery, groggy and in pain, and asking the nurse the only question that mattered to me. "How's my sister?" "She's doing well," the nurse. "The kidney is functioning beautifully." I cried in that recovery room, half from the anesthesia and half from something that felt enormous and uncomplicated and entirely good. My recovery took about 6 weeks before I felt fully like myself again. There was pain, more than I'd anticipated, and a fatigue that lingered longer than the surgeon had warned me about. I went back to work. I was in marketing for a regional healthcare company at the time, which felt almost too on the nose given what I'd just been through. About a month after surgery, still moving carefully, still aware of the incision sites in a way that made certain movements feel foreign. Paige's recovery, by contrast, was transformative. Within weeks, she had color back in her face. Within 2 months, she had energy she hadn't had in years. She started running again, something dialysis had made completely impossible. She got a promotion at her job that fall, something her doctors said would have been unthinkable while she was still tethered to a machine 3 times a week. I watched my sister come back to life, quite literally, and I felt something I can only describe as the deepest satisfaction I have ever experienced. Not pride exactly, something quieter and more fundamental than pride. The simple, bone-deep knowledge that I had done something that mattered more than almost anything else I would ever do. For about 2 years, our relationship felt closer than ever. Paige called me her hero, only half joking. She told the story of the transplant at family gatherings, at her work parties, to new friends she made in the running club she joined. She got a small tattoo on her side, near the scar from the transplant surgery, a tiny outline of a kidney bean with my initials hidden inside the design. She showed it to me the first time with tears in her eyes. "You gave me my life back," she said. "I believed in those years that whatever happened between us going forward, that bond was permanent, unbreakable. The kind of thing that couldn't be undone by ordinary sibling friction or distance, or the normal complications of two adult lives growing in different directions." I was wrong. The shift started, as these things often do, gradually enough that I didn't immediately register it as a shift at all. Paige met Connor about 2.5 years after the transplant. She was thriving by then, physically, professionally, in every visible way, the picture of someone who had survived something terrible and come out stronger. Connor was a sales director at a tech company in Dallas, charming in the easy way of someone who has never had to work very hard at being liked. They met through a mutual friend, started dating within weeks, and within 8 months were talking about moving in together. I liked Connor when I met him. He was attentive to Paige, funny in a self-deprecating way, seemed genuinely invested in her well-being. I had no reason to dislike him. What I noticed slowly was how the story changed when Connor was in the room. Paige had always told the transplant story with me at the center of it, her sister, her hero, the person who gave her a second chance at life. But as her relationship with Connor deepened, the story began shifting almost imperceptibly. She started telling it with more emphasis on her own resilience, her own fight, her own strength in surviving the disease. The donor became a detail rather than the centerpiece. Sometimes, in versions I overheard secondhand from family members, I wasn't mentioned by name at all, just a family member or my sister, in a tone that made it sound incidental. I told myself I was being sensitive, that it was natural for Paige to want to own her own survival story, to not always frame herself as someone who needed saving by someone else, even someone who loved her. I tried very hard to believe that explanation. The real fracture happened about 1.5 years ago, at a family dinner at our parents' house. Paige and Connor had just gotten engaged. A small, intimate proposal on a hiking trail that Paige had posted about extensively, dozens of photos, a caption about finding the person who truly saw her. We were sitting around the dinner table, and our mother, in the unguarded way mothers sometimes are, brought up the transplant. She was talking to Connor, telling him how proud she was of both her daughters, how remarkable it had been to watch Holly give Paige this gift. Connor said something kind in response, the appropriate thing to say. But Paige's face did something I'd never seen it do before during this particular topic. Something closed off, something almost irritated. "Mom, can we not make this whole dinner about the kidney thing?" she said. "It happened years ago, I'm fine now, I don't need it to be the headline of every family conversation forever." The table went quiet. I felt something land in my chest that took me along. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something closer to confusion, the particular disorientation of realizing a story you thought you both agreed on had quietly become a story only one of you was still telling. "I wasn't trying to make it the headline," our mother said carefully. "I was just proud of you both." "I know," Paige said. I'm so much more than that one thing, you know? I don't want to be the kidney transplant girl forever. I have a whole life now." I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth and didn't say anything. I told myself again that I was reading too much into a single comment at a single dinner. But the comment stayed with me in a way that small comments usually don't. I kept turning it over in the weeks that followed, examining it from different angles, trying to find an interpretation that didn't feel like what it actually was. 3 months later, wedding planning began in earnest. Paige and Connor had set a date for October, a venue outside Austin, a guest list that Paige started compiling on a shared spreadsheet she occasionally referenced in our text conversations. I assumed, without ever explicitly discussing it, that I would be a bridesmaid. Not out of entitlement, I want to be clear about that, but because Paige and I had talked years earlier, long before any engagement was on the horizon, about being in each other's weddings. It had been a casual conversation, the kind sisters have, but it had felt like a settled fact between us. In May, 5 months before the wedding, Paige sent a group text to what was clearly her bridal party, asking everyone to save a date for a dress fitting. I wasn't on the text. I stared at my phone for a long time after a cousin mentioned it to me, assuming I'd somehow missed an invitation, checking my messages obsessively for something I'd overlooked. There was nothing. I called Paige that evening. I tried to keep my voice light, casual, giving her every possible benefit of the doubt. "Hey, I heard about the dress fitting thing. I think I might have missed the text." There was a pause on the other end of the line that told me everything before she said a single word. "Oh," she said. "Holly, I should have talked to you about this directly. I'm sorry you heard it secondhand." "Talk to me about what?" Another pause. I decided to keep the bridal party smaller this time. Just my closest friends from Dallas plus Connor's sister. It's not about you specifically. I just wanted something more intimate. I sat very still on my couch, phone pressed against my ear, trying to process what I was actually hearing. Am I invited to the wedding at all? I asked. I hated how small my voice sounded asking that question. Another pause, longer this time. Of course you're invited. I would never not invite my own sister to my wedding. That part at least turned out to be true in the narrowest possible sense. I received a wedding invitation 6 weeks later, addressed to me and a +1, identical to the 140 other invitations page, and Connor sent out to acquaintances, coworkers, and extended family. I was invited to the wedding the way you invite a distant cousin, not the way you invite the person who gave you an organ. I want to pause here and explain something about what those months felt like, because I think it's easy from the outside to wonder why I was so hurt by what might look like a relatively minor social slight. A bridal party is not a legal document. Being excluded from one is not, on its face, a catastrophic betrayal. But it wasn't really about the bridal party. It was about what the exclusion represented. A quiet, deliberate decision to minimize my role in her life at the exact moment when our family's narrative of the past few years would naturally be most visible. Weddings are when families tell their stories to each other, to new in-laws, to friends meeting each other for the first time. Paige had decided, consciously or not, that the story she wanted to tell at her wedding was not one where her sister occupied a central. I tried to talk to her about it directly, calmly, several times over the following months. Each conversation followed roughly the same pattern. I would express that I felt hurt, that I didn't understand why our relationship didn't merit a place in her wedding party given everything we'd been through together. She would tell me I was reading too much into it, that the wedding wasn't a referendum on our relationship, that I needed to separate the kidney donation from how she organized her wedding logistics. You can't keep using the kidney as leverage in every conversation, she said, during one particularly difficult call in August. I gave you so much credit for years. I told everyone how amazing you were. But at some point, I need to be able to make decisions about my own life and my own wedding without it being weighed against this one thing you did for me 3 years ago. This one thing, I repeated. Paige, I gave you an organ out of my body. I will live the rest of my life with one kidney because of you. I know, she said, her voice tightening. I know that and I am grateful, but I cannot live the rest of my life feeling like I owe you infinite, permanent access to every important moment because of it. That's not healthy for either of us. I'm not asking for infinite access. I'm asking why I'm not in your wedding party. Because I wanted my closest friend standing up there with me, she said. And I'm sorry if that hurts you, but that's the honest answer. I asked her directly whether our relationship had changed since she met Connor. She was quiet for a long moment. I think I've grown a lot in the last few years, she said finally. And I think some of that growth has been about figuring out who I am outside of being the sick sister, or the transplant recipient, or the person who needs saving. I love you. I will always be grateful to you. But I think you've struggled to let me become anything other than the person. That sentence sat in my chest for a long time after the call ended. I want to be fair here because I've thought about this a great deal in the months since, and I don't think Paige is a villain. I think there is something real in what she said, something about identity, about the difficulty of building a sense of self when a single defining event sits at the center of how everyone, including yourself, understands your story. I think it's possible to be enormously grateful for a gift and also feel suffocated by the way that gift gets retold, again and again at every family gathering as the thing that defines you. I think all of that can be true. I also think it doesn't excuse what came next. In September, a month before the wedding, Paige called me again. This time her tone was different, guarded, careful, like she was approaching a conversation she'd rehearsed. I need to ask you something. And I need you to really hear me before you react. Okay, at the wedding, I don't want there to be a moment where the kidney thing comes up. Not in toasts, not in conversations with Connor's family, not anywhere. I've talked to Mom and Dad about it too. I just want one day where that's not the story everyone is telling about me. I sat with the phone against my ear and felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. You want me to pretend? I want you to let me have one day where it's not the headline, she said. That's all I'm asking. Paige, you asked me to remove a kidney from my body so you could live. I don't know how to attend your wedding and pretend that's a footnote. It's not a footnote to me either, she said, her voice cracking slightly. But I need it to not be the only thing people see when they look at us. I need you to understand that I am drowning under the weight of being permanently defined by the worst thing that ever happened to me. Every time someone tells that story, I go right back to being the sick girl. I am so tired of being the sick girl, Holly. I want to be a bride. Just for one day I want to be a bride and not a transplant patient. I understood in that moment something about my sister that I hadn't fully let myself see before. Her resentment. It was about the disease itself, about years of her identity being collapsed into illness, about a body that had betrayed her, and a story that refused to let her move past it. But understanding that didn't make the request feel any less impossible. I don't think I can do that, I said quietly. I don't think I can sit at your wedding and pretend that something that nearly cost you your life, something that I gave a piece of my body to fix, simply doesn't exist. Maybe you shouldn't come, Paige said. The words landed like something physical. Are you disinviting me from your wedding? I'm saying, she said carefully, that if you can't respect what I'm asking for on the one day that's supposed to be about me and Connor, then maybe it's better if you sit this one out. I didn't say anything for a long moment. You said it yourself, I finally managed. I'm too dramatic about my own role in keeping you alive. That's not fair. Isn't it? I asked. You just told me the thing that saved your life is too dramatic a topic for your wedding day. She didn't respond to that. I didn't go to the wedding. I want to be careful here because I know how this might sound from the outside, like a petty standoff. Two sisters digging in over hurt feelings, neither willing to bend. But it wasn't that, not for me. It was something closer to grief. I grieved in the weeks leading up to October. The version of my sister who had cried with gratitude over a tattoo of a kidney bean, who had called me her hero in front of strangers, who had held my hand across the gap between two hospital gurneys and said, "I'll see you on the other side." That version of Paige felt, by October, like someone I had lost entirely, replaced by a stranger who needed me to disappear from her own narrative in order to feel whole. I wrote something honest in it, that I loved her, that I wished her and Connor a beautiful life together, that I hoped someday we could find our way back to each other without one of us having to erase part of the truth to make that possible. I didn't hear back. The wedding happened on a Saturday in October. I know this because our mother sent me photos, unprompted, a few days later, not out of malice, I don't think, but out of a kind of helpless hope that seeing the day might soften something in me. Paige looked beautiful. Connor looked happy. The whole thing looked, from the photographs, like exactly the wedding she'd always wanted. I looked at those photos for a long time, sitting alone in my apartment, my hand resting against the scar on my side that I can still feel sometimes on cold mornings, a permanent physical record of a decision I have never once regretted making. What I regret, if I regret anything, is not the kidney. What I regret is believing that an act of that magnitude created a bond that nothing could break. I think I built an entire understanding of my relationship with Paige around the assumption that what I gave her was permanent, unshakable, a debt of love so large it would simply override any future conflict between us. I've had to learn, slowly and painfully over the past several months, that gratitude and resentment can live in the same person at the same time. That person can be permanently changed by what you did for them, and still need desperately to escape it. That love does not actually function as a ledger, with one enormous deposit guaranteeing decades of automatic credit. I still don't fully know how to feel about all of this. Some days I feel a clean, hard anger that surprises me with its intensity. Other days I feel only sadness, a low ache for the relationship we used to have and might never fully recover. Occasionally, on the better days, I manage something closer to understanding, an acknowledgement that Paige's need to separate herself from her illness, however clumsily and painfully she went about it, comes from a real and human place. My mother has tried gently to broker some kind of reconciliation in the months since the wedding. Paige and I exchanged a few stilted texts around the holidays. We have not had a real conversation since the one where she asked me to sit. I don't know what happens next between us. I don't know if there's a version of this relationship that survives what happened, or if Paige and I are simply two people who used to be sisters in the fullest sense of the word, and are now something more distant, more careful, separated by a wedding invitation that arrived addressed like I was anyone else. What I know for certain is this. I would give Paige my kidney again, exactly the same way, if I had to make that choice over from them. That decision was never about being thanked forever. It was about my sister staying alive. She is alive. She is married. She is, by every external measure, thriving. I have to believe that matters more than whether I had a seat at the table when she celebrated it. Some days I almost believe that completely. Other days, the only thing I can feel is the scar on my side and the silence where my sister used to be. There's a part of this story I haven't told yet, one I've gone back and forth about including, but I think it matters because it changed how I understand everything that happened afterward. About 6 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from our father. He doesn't call often, that's always been my mother's role in the family, the one who handles communication, who relays information, who checks in. So when his name appeared on my phone on a Tuesday evening, I knew something significant must have prompted it. He told me Paige had called him the night before, crying, unable to sleep. She'd had what he described as a kind of breakdown, not dramatic, not destructive, just a long, exhausted unraveling that had apparently been building for months. She told him she missed me. She told him she didn't understand how she'd let things get this bad, how a single difficult conversation about a wedding had somehow metastasized into months of silence between two people who used to tell each other everything. She told him she'd been seeing a therapist since September, something I hadn't known, and that the therapist had helped her understand something about her own behavior that she hadn't been able to see clearly on her own. According to my father, she said this, that her entire identity since the transplant had been built around two competing narratives that she'd never been able to fully reconcile. The first narrative was gratitude, genuine, overwhelming gratitude toward me for giving her a second chance at life. The second narrative was resentment, not at me specifically, but at the disease, at the years of feeling broken, at the way every person who looked at her seemed to see a patient before they saw a person. She said she had, somewhere in the process of falling in love with Connor and building a life that felt new and untainted by illness, started directing that second narrative at me, because I was the most visible, most permanent reminder of everything she was trying to leave behind. She told my father she understood now, with some distance and some professional help, that this wasn't fair, that I hadn't done anything except save her life and then continue to exist as a person who knew exactly what that had cost both of us. That punishing me for being the keeper of that memory was, in her therapist's words, a way of trying to control something that felt otherwise uncontrollable, the permanent, irreversible fact of her own illness. I listened to my father relay all of this and felt something complicated move through me. Not immediate forgiveness, not relief exactly, but something like recognition, the sense that the version of Paige I'd lost over the summer hadn't actually disappeared, just gotten buried under something she hadn't yet learned how to carry. I didn't call her immediately. I want to be honest about that. I needed time to sit with what I'd heard, to make sure I wasn't simply rushing back into a relationship pattern where I absorbed whatever hurt I'd been handed because the alternative, losing my sister entirely, felt unbearable. I waited almost 3 weeks. When I finally called her, she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. We talked for almost 2 hours. She apologized in a way that felt different from anything she'd said during our August and September conversations, less defensive, more willing to simply sit in the discomfort of having been wrong without immediately explaining why it had felt necessary at the time. She told me about the therapy. She told me she'd realized, in session after session, that she had spent 3 years performing gratitude toward me in public, while privately working through something closer to grief. Grief for the version of herself that existed before the diagnosis. Grief for a body she no longer fully trusted. Grief that had nowhere appropriate to go, because how do you grieve in the presence of the person who saved you? How do you express anger at an illness when the most visible I told her as honestly as I could what the exclusion from the wedding had actually done to me. Not just the hurt of the moment, but the deeper unraveling it caused, the way it made me question whether the entire foundation of our relationship since the transplant had been built on something more fragile than I'd understood. She cried. I cried too eventually, something I hadn't let myself do in the months since October. We are not fully back to where we were. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this one are sometimes told with a neat, complete resolution that doesn't reflect how relationships actually heal. Paige and I talk now regularly, carefully. We've had 2 more difficult conversations since that first phone call, working through layers of hurt that didn't resolve themselves in a single 2-hour conversation, no matter how honest it was. She invited me to dinner with her and Connor about 2 months ago, the first time I'd seen them together since the engagement announcement. It was a small thing, an ordinary Tuesday dinner at a restaurant near her apartment, but it felt significant in a way that ordinary dinners rarely do. Connor, for his part, was kind and a little awkward, clearly aware of the history between us in a way he hadn't fully understood before. Near the end of the dinner, Paige reached across the table and took my hand, the same way she used to across hospital gurneys. I know I can't undo October, she said. I know there isn't a version of this where I get to take back what I said or how I said it. But I want you to know that I see what I did now, clearly, without the protection of telling myself it was reasonable. And I am sorry completely without conditions. I told her I appreciated that. I told her I was still working through my own feelings, that healing wasn't going to happen on the timeline either of us might want, but that I was grateful she'd found her way back to being honest with herself, even if it had taken losing something to get there. I don't know exactly what our relationship looks like going forward. I don't think either of us fully knows yet. We are rebuilding something that broke in a way that left visible cracks, the kind of cracks that don't disappear just because the structure is standing again. But I no longer feel like I lost my sister entirely. I feel instead like I'm watching her become a more complete, more honest version of herself, one who can hold gratitude and resentment in the same hand without needing to erase the person who gave her the life she's now fighting to fully own. I still have I still have one kidney. I will live the rest of my life with the physical reminder of a decision I have never once regretted, no matter how complicated the aftermath became. And I am learning slowly that love between sisters is not always linear. Sometimes it breaks in ways that look permanent and then, against every reasonable expectation, finds its way back toward repair. I don't know if Paige and I will ever fully return to who we were before the wedding. I'm not sure that's even the right goal. Maybe what we're building now is something different, more honest, more carefully tended, less dependent on one enormous act of love carrying the entire weight of a relationship that needed all along to be built on more than gratitude alone. I gave my sister a kidney 3 years ago. I am still, in ways I am only beginning to understand, learning what it means to give her something even harder. The space to become someone whole on her own terms without losing me in the process. We are both still learning how to hold both of those truths at once. I think finally we might actually get there.